Being in a workplace, even a great one, can mean the occasional brush with a bullshitter, but you can avoid getting mired in their stuff if you stay alert. So hi, and welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where every week I talk through an item on a list made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. So this week, here we are back in the work category again. You know, we arrived at summer officially just last week. We had the beautiful strawberry full moon a few days ago, and we are now fully immersed in popsicle season, and that makes it hard to focus on work. But work is eternal. It's a big part of my life and probably yours, so here we are with thing number 12. Beware of bullshitters. And obviously, this has applications in every area of life, but I've put it in the work category because I think that's one of the most crucial places to kind of have your bullshit radar on. And by the way, I apologize for the cussiness of this episode, but I think bullshit detection is one of the best skills you can cultivate in any workplace because, my friends, the bullshitters are there somewhere, occasionally bullshitting around in even the best offices and teams. So this sounds pretty cynical and jaded to start out with. But I want to say at the outset that I work in a fantastic firm now, and I have largely always worked in good places. And this is not a way for me to land some embittered blows on my office mate from behind the cover of a podcast. This is just sort of a compilation, a composite bit of wisdom that I've built up over the years, which is decades of working in many different workplaces and in a really wide breadth of environments and atmospheres. And all this time working in all the sectors, service and government and education and nonprofit and corporate and consulting, and probably a few that I've forgotten, all of that has taught me that there are fantastic, brilliant, ethical, giving people working everywhere at every level. And there are a lot of great colleagues out there. I think most people I've worked with either fall into this top tier of awesomeness or, at worst, they live in the next level down of pretty innocuous, pretty decent folks who just want to do their work and go home with no harm done and no hard feelings. And yet, it bears consideration that every once in a while, the fact of the matter is you'll find yourself with a bullshitter in your workplace. So, what are we talking about when we talk about bullshitters? There's a fantastic book about bullshit and what it is rhetorically and operationally by a guy named Harry G. Frankfurt, who was a moral philosopher who died just last year, I think. He wrote several books and essays over his very long career. I think he was about 95 when he died, and he had continued writing well into his 80s, if I'm remembering correctly. But his big breakaway hit, if you will, was 2005's book On Bullshit. In it, he kind of works toward a definition of bullshit as something that stops just short of lying and as an activity that is more aimed at skewing the impressions you have of the person who is bullshitting you than it is really aimed at the misrepresentation or alteration of specific facts or pieces of information. So his thought is that bullshitting is really more about the person doing it than the misinformation they bring to bear. It's an exercise in weaving together a false image. It's like photoshopping your self-presentation in a way. And despite the fact that bullshitting typically stops short of lying, in his model anyway, Frankfurt argues that the act of bullshitting is actually pretty pernicious, in part because it's harder to detect than a straight-up factual lie, and because it's relational. We don't have relationships with misinformation directly, but we can form deep attachments with fake people, and the latter can be more dangerous and damaging than the former. Today, I'm just going to run through 3 types of bullshitters that I think are some of the most common in the workplace, at least in my experience. The first kind of bullshitter that I've run across repeatedly in the workplace is what I'm going to call the CYA technician. Sometimes this is an otherwise cool person who makes a mistake, as we all do, and is really thrown by that. So instead of owning up, they cover their asses. Maybe they try desperately to fix things behind the scenes while hiding the mistake, which is probably the most relatable form of bullshitting. I think we've all done that. But sometimes this person's a little more devious, and they move beyond hiding a problem to shifting the blame for it. Hopefully, they target only nameless, faceless culprits. Maybe some unspecified person or people at the printer or another office or the FedEx Corporation. But occasionally, it can escalate to the point that the bullshitter is throwing specific innocent people by name under the bus. I think most of us have moonlighted at some point as the CYA tech. I think it's easy to understand the desire to wiggle out from under some mess we've created. But most of us eventually learn that when we do that, we screw over other people, and we accordingly stop doing it. If I notice that I'm working with somebody who hasn't learned that lesson or who just doesn't care, it puts me on my guard. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're being blamed by one of these types, I've learned that it helps to get your file of receipts together and go wide with that conversation. I'm an advocate of putting everybody involved on the same thread or in the same meeting, because this kind of bullshitter loves to hide out in layers of compartmentalized communication. So a second style of bullshitter that I've run across multiple times in the workplace is what I call the pretender. This is a person who alludes to having capacities and knowledge that they just do not have. And this can happen in the hiring stage. I think maybe that's where it's most common with, inflation of your resume or whatever. But it can also continue for years in an organization. Again, sometimes this is just a decent person who's caught up in a tough situation where they feel like they're expected to deliver more than they can or know more than they know. And they might defensively, in a moment of panic, fib just a little bit about their capacities. People aren't going to raise their hands and say, hey, I'm an expert in Excel when they've never opened Excel. But if their boss comes at them demanding a spreadsheet in a tough situation, they might find themselves saying, sure, I can handle that, even if they're unsure if they can. And that kind of thing can cause issues for a whole lot of people in a whole lot of ways. Sometimes these people put in a frenzied effort to learn what they lack quickly, and they actually pull it off. I've seen that happen once or twice. But sometimes they flail around without having a plan or throwing a flag or asking for help until their team misses a deadline or a deliverable gets compromised. Again, I think most of us have been there, where pride and fear and embarrassment just make us overpromise. And then there's what I like to think of as the proactive pretender, which is closer to being a liar than a bullshitter, and which is way more perplexing to me and more infuriating. This is a person who learns just enough about an area of expertise to bullshit. And they bullshit instead of continuing to learn and building a legit expertise. I had this happen once with a colleague who billed themselves as the resident expert in a very technical thing. I'm not going to say what it was. It wasn't embroidery, but let's use that as an example. So this jackass pretended to know how to embroider, and I just took them at their word. And for years, I went to them for embroidery advice, which I passed on to clients to their detriment and to the detriment of our entire company. And finally, I started to notice that some of their best practice advice on embroidery wasn't matching up with advice from other sources. So I did a little research, read like one single comprehensive book, and realized that this person didn't have the slightest clue about embroidery beyond the very basics. Like, they knew it involved needles and string, and everything else they offered was just bluff. These days, enough time has passed that I can kind of chuckle about that experience, but at the time, it was horrifying and infuriating. Unfortunately, some people want the respect and clout and job security and even pay that specialized knowledge can give them, but they don't want to do the work of earning or maintaining a real expertise. And while most people, I think the vast, vast majority of people would never do anything like this, there is a tiny but treacherous little subset out there who will just build a castle in the sky entirely out of bullshit. It's astonishing. And if you find yourself starting to suspect that you're relying on a bullshitter for important technical information or expertise, maybe do a little Googling, read up a little, Make sure what they're saying slots up with other experts. The last kind of bullshitter that I see a lot in the wild is what I'm going to call a chameleon. This is somebody who is a different person with different grievances and different loyalties, depending entirely on who's in the room with them at the time. To be fair, we all, to some extent, adapt how we act in the situation we're in. We may be more formal if our boss is in the room and a lot less guarded if we're just talking to members of our own little team. But I think the litmus test is how people treat one another in terms of respect and kindness and decency. If you notice that someone is cordial to you or one of your coworkers in a certain circumstance and then throws a complete tone switch when the crowd thins out or the supervisor walks away, that's another matter then. And if you find yourself in a situation where, in addition to their tone, their facts and opinions and positions are slipping around, you'll know that you're way over the line even between bullshitting and just lying. Personally, I'd rather deal with someone who is consistently a little crusty or a little snarly than deal with that kind of Jekyll and Hyde stuff. And if you find yourself watching a bullshitter pick on someone when the boss isn't looking, it can sometimes be helpful to challenge them if you feel comfortable. Sometimes just saying something like, "Hey, has something happened? You were fine with Tom's performance 10 minutes ago. The swerve in your feedback is confusing me," can make a bit of a difference if you feel comfortable wading in, if you think it'll help. Sometimes you can become another person that they feel like they can't be an asshole in front of. And while that doesn't solve the bigger problem, it does afford your coworkers some more cover, maybe another safe space in the office while they work on slaying the larger dragon. Now again, these have been exceptions and not rules over the many, many years that I have been working with many, many people, many of whom were awesome and almost all of whom were at least ethical. But once in a while, a bullshitter strolls into the office, and that's when I start saving receipts, as we discussed in episode 9 when I talked about fair fighting. But still, most of the time, my coworkers are not bullshitters. I'm lucky that way. In fact, I've learned that it's almost more important for me to use what I've learned about the art of bullshitting to hoe my own row, as we say in the Midwest. It's critical that I beware even, and maybe especially, my own bullshit. And to do that, I try to keep these 3 truths in mind, because I think they kind of inoculate me against my own BS. First, it's okay to make mistakes. For those of you who are younger and just starting out in the world of work, let me say that again. It is okay to make mistakes. Everybody screws something up sometimes. I'm talking about you, I'm talking about me, I'm talking about the CEO of the company. I'm very good at what I do, but I make mistakes all the time. That's the price I pay for taking creative and strategic risks. And sometimes it's just the price we all pay for being human. It's okay. I do realize that this isn't true for all workplaces. And if you find yourself in a place where an honest mistake is weaponized instead of worked out, then unfortunately you're probably working for people with a bigger workplace toxicity problem than occasional bullshit. But for the most part, I have found that if you take responsibility for what you've gotten wrong, if you own it and you strive to make it right, you usually earn more credibility and trust from the people around you. Overall, people respect those who can own their own shit. And in those moments when I'm tempted to be a CYA tech and squirm out from under my own messes, I know that I'm relinquishing the opportunity to grow in my role. Second, it's okay not to know everything. I bear certain responsibilities. I should be prepared to do my job to the extent that I can be. I should make efforts to stay current in my field. I should be able to lean into my experience and problem solve on my feet. Those are fair expectations for me. But I don't know everything, and nobody does. And in those moments when I find myself not knowing something, I've learned that my best course of action is almost always to admit that and then dedicate myself to finding the answer I haven't yet found. I credit my years teaching with this realization. You can read a book 1,000 times, and if you are teaching literature and you step into a classroom full of 25 students who have read the same book, someone is going to come at that from an angle that you haven't anticipated, and they're eventually going to ask a question that you can't answer confidently on the fly. And in those moments, you can either get defensive and feel that you have failed in some completely untenable role as an omnipotent font of knowledge, or you can be a human and say, wow, that's a really good question that I haven't thought about yet. Let's find the answer together. You're always better off going with option number 2 in a classroom, by the way. And in business, I think it's much the same. When I take responsibility for mistakes or I acknowledge something that I don't know yet, it actually makes people trust me even more because they know I'm not blowing smoke. They know I'm not making things up on the fly. They've come to trust me more as a straight shooter. And I think they give me more credit for intellectual humility and professional integrity. And once again, if I choose instead to be a pretender, either reactively or proactively, I lose that opportunity to connect as a human being and to grow. And I might actually cut myself off from some really great insights that the people around me will offer if they're invited to do so. And on strictly practical terms, if I choose to be a pretender, I run the risk of being found out, just like my pretender coworker eventually was. And that's never a good thing, and things can actually get really ugly when that happens. And finally, number 3, I just want to be the same person in every room. I want to live by a consistent set of values, and I don't want to morph into the most politically expedient form for every occasion. That's exhausting and it's icky, and I don't want to do it. Like everybody else, I modify my tone to fit the audience, and I sometimes share things in one setting that I wouldn't share in another. But I've learned over the years that I really do want to show up as an authentic version of myself whenever it's even remotely possible. And I know now that if I find myself speaking with a different voice or espousing different positions depending on who is in the room with me, I'm losing that battle. And I'm becoming something I really don't want to be. I'm becoming the bullshitter. Okay, quick execution score, 7 out of 10. I am better about living a no bullshit work life than I was when I was younger, when I was more afraid of my own mistakes and more embarrassed by the gaps in my own knowledge. I think this is something most of us just get better at as we age up, but I'm docking 3 points because every now and then, even now, after all these years, I can feel a tiny little surge of reactive pretender bullshit wanting to come out. It can be hard, even for me, even at this age, to just say when I don't know the answer right away, at least in some contexts. But it's always, always better to know what you don't know and to be honest about that. Okay, I think that's enough work bullshit for one day. If you are a parent listening to this episode with a child, as some of my friends quite possibly are, I do apologize for introducing this word indelibly into their vocabulary. Thanks for spending some time with me today anyway. I'll be back next week with thing number 13.